When a government spends more than it collects by way of revenue, it incurs a budget deficit. The revenue deficit refers to the excess of government's revenue expenditure over revenue receipts. Revenue deficit is equal to revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. The revenue deficit includes only such transactions that affect the current income and expenditure of the government. When the government incurs a revenue deficit, it implies that the government is saving and is using up the savings of the other sectors of the economy to finance a part of its consumption expenditure. This situation means that the government will have to borrow not only to finance its investment but also its consumption requirements. This will lead to a build-up of stock of debt and interest liabilities and force the government, eventually, to cut expenditure. Since a major part of revenue expenditure is committed expenditure, it cannot be reduced. Often the government reduces productive capital expenditure or welfare expenditure. This would mean lower growth and adverse welfare implications. Now, let's know about next deficit, fiscal deficit, which is the difference between the government's total expenditure and its total receipts. Excluding borrowing, gross fiscal deficit is equal to total expenditure minus revenue receipts and non-debt creating capital receipts. Non-debt creating capital receipts are those receipts which are not borrowings and, therefore, do not give rise to debt. Examples are recovery of loans and the proceeds from the sale of SUs. The fiscal deficit will have to be financed through borrowing. Thus, it indicates the total borrowing requirements of the government from all sources. From the financing side, gross fiscal deficit equals net borrowing at home plus borrowing from RBI plus borrowing from abroad. A large share of revenue deficit in fiscal deficit indicated that a large part of borrowing is being used to meet its consumption expenditure needs rather than investment. Primary deficit. The borrowing requirement of the government includes interest obligations on accumulated debt. The goal of measuring primary deficit is to focus on present fiscal imbalances. It is simply the fiscal deficit minus the interest payments. Gross primary deficit equals gross fiscal deficit. Net interest liabilities. Net interest liabilities consist of interest payments minus interest receipts by the government on net domestic lending.